So thank you for joining and welcome to our Wednesday Smiley Talk, Empathy into Action. So I'm really excited about this talk. We're going to be talking about how powerful empathy can be, not just as a human quality, but also something that can inspire action and can inspire positivity within our society and communities. So we are running this event alongside Empathy Lab UK ahead of their Empathy Day on the 9th of June. The theme for this year is Empathy, Our Human Superpower. So we'll be finding out why empathy is such a human superpower during this talk. And it's going to be hosted by Rae, our Smiley Movement Education Ambassador, who is a head teacher at a primary school in Cambridge. But before we go into that, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of Smiley Movement. So we are running this Smiley Talk. We are a non-profit sponsored by the original Smiley brand, and we have an overarching aim of inspiring people to drive positive change in the world. We align all our work, our Smiley Talks, our Smiley News. We have a podcast with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So they are striving towards a happier, healthier, and more equal society. And we want to spotlight the people and the organisations who are striving towards that too. So before I hand over, I just wanted to say, if you have any questions while you're watching, whether that's on Twitter, Facebook or YouTube, please feel free to pop them in the comments and we will be able to feed them through to our speakers and get them answered near the end of the hour. But without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over to Rae, who will be introducing our speakers and getting ahead with the discussion.
Thank you so much, Amy. As ever, it's really lovely to be here and to bring a bit of positivity to the world. So I'm going to start off by introducing each of our three guests this morning, and then we're going to get into some of the questions. And if you've got questions at home, please, as you've just heard from Amy, please do let us have those questions, and we'll be answering those towards the end of the hour. So I'm going to start first with Miranda. So Miranda McKerney is a social justice entrepreneur who has spent 35 years turning kitchen table ideas into something truly transformative. Something that many of you may have heard about is the Reading Agency, and in particular, the charity Summer Reading Challenge, which now involves 800,000 children every year. Having, in theory, retired, Miranda turned her attention to the importance of empathy. And having done her research, she then became a co founder of Empathy Lab. And we're going to hear more about that in a few minutes. The second person I'd really like to introduce you to today is Helen Demetriou. Helen is a chartered psychologist and teaches not very far from me at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. Her research covers developmental psychology and education with a particular focus on work that she's turned into publications on children's friendships, involving pupil consultation, and the importance of empathy. And again, I'm looking forward to hearing a bit more from Helen about how her research aligns with this idea of empathy and its superpower. Last, but by no means least, we have Sita Brahmachari, who won the Waterstones Children's Book Prize with her debut book, Artichoke Hearts, and is one of the most important voices in children's books today. Her books have been shortlisted for the UKLA Book Award and nominated for a Carnegie Medal. Her books have been translated into many languages around the world. And not only that, Sita works in all sorts of domains, showing how important storytelling is in building communities and developing that sense of society. So welcome each and every one of you. I'm sorry that I might have rushed those introductions, but I do want to get us into a conversation. So Miranda, if I may start with you. Um, as I said, in theory, you'd retired from this amazing organization that you'd started, the Reading Agency, but then you turned your interest towards empathy. Why did that happen, and when was it, and how's it been since then, and since co-founding Empathy Lab?
Yeah, so when I thought I was retiring, I was very interested in a building body of research, which my four fellow Empathy Lab founders were as well, which was a building body of neuroscience and psychology research showing that reading builds real life empathy. And I thought, wow, are we making enough of this? Because as a society and an education system, because books are ubiquitous in education, in homes, in libraries. And if you could springboard off that to build children's empathy skills, that would be absolutely amazing. So we started researching, and we worked very closely with academics and discovered too that empathy was learnable, which a lot of people think we're kind of born with. You're either born empathetic or you're not. But actually, it's a learnable skill. And Helen's research has pointed us in the direction of research which shows that only 10% of our empathic ability is genetic. So off the back of that, we experimented for about 4 years. We were founded in 2014, and our program has now settled into an in-depth schools program, an annual Read for Empathy book collection, which Sita's books have appeared in many times, and Empathy Day coming up in June. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And our mission is to raise an empathy-educated generation, hoping that the rising generation are amazing young people, might do very much better than my generation has in building an empathetic world. And I think we're the first organisation to really systematically use literature to build children's empathy and literacy skills, and crucially, their social activism.
Thank you so much, Miranda. In that, you mentioned a startling statistic, and I don't know how many of our viewers watching at home have picked up on that. So, only 10% of our genetic ability, our ability to be empathetic is only 10% of our genes, and then the rest of the 90% can be taught. So if I could come to you, Helen, please, if you can tell us a little bit more about the research that underpins the work that Empathy Lab are doing. I find this part particularly fascinating.
Thank you so much, Rae. Yes, and absolutely what you've just said is correct. We are this superpower that you've been talking about of empathy is around at the beginning of our lives. What has been shown, though, as Miranda said, is that there's not very much of it. Children do develop it. I am a psychologist by trade originally, and I've been researching empathy for the last 30 years. The last quarter of a century, though, has been in education. So it's been very interesting to see how my empathy research has woven into that and the impact on learners and their academic, but also their well-being. So yes, so in terms of the empathy we're born with, it is a small amount. It's been shown that children by the age of about 2 develop more of it as they socialize, as they integrate. It's even now been found actually to be seen in even 8-month-olds. So as research is refined, we can maybe see a little bit more of it happening earlier. But the point is, yes, we're not born with enough. We do a lot. We do need that interaction does help us. And what also has been shown very interestingly is that we can lose it along the way as adults. So neuroscientific research has shown that empathy that is built up from early on can get lost along the way. But also that there is a lot of scope for learning empathy. So, and research such as Empathy Lab, using literature, but other research as well within psychology and education has shown that empathy can be taught.
Wonderful. I've got so many questions that I want to come back to you on, Helen. But before I do that, I'll come to you, Sita, if I may. I'm really pleased to say that our children here love your books, and our Year 5s in particular have been involved in some of the projects that Empathy Lab have done to engage children in building brains through books for empathy, and your books particularly develop that sense of awareness through characterization and settings and so on. So I wondered, as an author particularly aligned with the work that Miranda and the rest of the team are doing, and you are doing, what inspires you to write stories that are going to develop empathy, and how do you go about it, and how do we use books so that it becomes this springboard for activism? Lots of questions there, sorry.
I'm going to try and answer those questions. First of all, the first thing that I always do when I'm writing a story is picture the children and picture the diverse range of children that we're writing for. And I think about a global portal. And I think about my own diaspora identity with kind of big branches and roots all over the world. And I think about what children see. And when I was first invited to come and see the work that Miranda was doing at Empathy Lab, she brought together a whole host of people, writers, psychologists, scientists, leaders, people who have influence over children's lives. And my heart just swelled because I just thought, finally, I'm in an environment with these children's books that I write where the whole child is being recognised. And also, what is being respected is what children see about the world today, what is happening in the world today. So when I was growing up, I felt that sometimes the children's books that I was reading, I couldn't find myself in, but also I couldn't find this kind of wide global perspective that was part of my childhood and growing up. And I was really searching for it. So all my work in writing and community and education has been about trying to hold a mirror up to the world that we're living in, but also I've got a lot of rivers in my stories and trying to find a kind of journey through for the characters. I find that I write about intergenerational characters, so there may be people here of every different generation. And when I first set out to write my first story, Artichoke Hearts, I didn't really write it for thinking I'm writing this for children. I wrote it into childhood, which is something I respect greatly. All of us can remember, how we felt at a particular moment where we saw injustice as a child. And, we can almost feel that viscerally in our bodies when we think about those things. And so I tell young people that often my kind of empathy pen is very much at the forefront when I'm writing my novels. And I'm very much in contact with the child that is seeing, for example, how refugee children are being treated in the world today, who is seeing poverty and inequality within their schools. I'm very much in contact with the emotions of how young people are thinking. And I'm wanting to place those characters in my stories. And once I place them in my stories in an intergenerational way, my plots start to arrive. And really, the whole of the stories are a journey to empathy. I've got one of the stories here, Tender Earth. And it is a tender earth that we're living on. And children see that. And you'll see on the cover, there's also a young girl, Lila Levinson, in this story, and she's holding up a banner. And the banner that she's holding up is for an anti-racist march that she goes on, because in her school and in her environment, she sees racism towards many different people. And she wants to do something about it. But she first learns about it rather gently through a kinder transport grandmother who is looking at the various refugee crises in the world today. And she is saying, how can this be? And these children in my stories, in the world, in our classrooms, our own children, are leaning in and they are listening to how the adult world is empathizing and how they're modeling empathy. So for me, I think probably the most important superpower that I have is to model in my stories the young characters placing empathy into action.
That's just so beautiful and so inspiring what you've said, and your respect for this very precious time of childhood is just so beautiful to hear about this morning or this afternoon. And I loved what you said about that visceral sense of childhood, and how important it is, those formative years, to who we become in adult life, and just how aware children are of the world around them. And as I said before, I've now got more questions I want to ask you, but I'm going to jump back, if I may, now to you, Helen. Part partly because I'm just very curious from a really pragmatic standpoint. I love this combination, this triangulation between this idea of we can build empathy, we can put it into action. Books really help us to do that. The conversation, the dialogue helps to embed that idea of the importance of empathy and the characters and so on. But I think what's so exciting is this part about the science. And you were talking about the 2-year-olds and the 18-month-olds developing and having a sense of empathy. I know nothing about your world and the psychology that you do. But I would love to know a bit more about how do you see this? How do we see 2-year-olds demonstrating empathy?
Thank you, Rae. That's a lovely question, and you can, and it all depends how things are researched, not just in psychology and education, but in other obviously disciplines. The way I research this, and which can be researched, it can be done in a number of ways, but there are observations. And way back for my own PhD, I researched seeing empathy via observations. How does it happen? We code for it. We code for certain actions, and we interpret them to a degree, but we think that what we're seeing is a certain behavior. Is it empathy? But that starts with a definition, and it starts with how we see children interacting and what they do. And in my case, in my research, the context was distress. So anytime a child became distressed, how would their peers then react to that distress? What type of response would they make? Sita said something very interesting about how she related to the characters in her books. And there are two main types of empathy. There's an emotional type of empathy, which is affective, where I feel what the person is going through. And then there's more cognitive empathy, a perspective-taking empathy, where I'm actually thinking more consciously about what you're going through. And these are the types of empathy that I identified through my observations, but also through my interviews that I did with primary school children. Also now, neuroscience has opened up a whole new field of identifying empathy. And in the brain, there are structures, various structures, in fact, lots of structures that relate to empathy. In fact, half the brain does in some way or another, from the mirror neurons to our limbic system. But there's a certain activity called mu suppression. And whenever that happens in the brain, and we can see that happening in scans, we know that empathy is happening. And this is where we can see through neuroscience that children are responding empathically, and also shows us how much they're doing it, and compared to adults. And this is where that research has shown, for example, that we can lose it, because when people look at different scenarios, adults have been shown, for example, to show less empathy where discrimination is concerned, for example. So this is cause for, if you like, concern, and to try and do something about learning empathy along the way. So this is how we, in a nutshell, can measure it in science and research.
I'm really fascinated to hear about that distinction between the affective, the feeling of it, and also the cognitive perspective taking. And that's a definition that I'd love to, well, I'll be talking to my colleagues about, because that makes so much sense to me. I can really feel something that somebody might be going through, but also to sort of metacognitive level, I'm assessing what the process is. And I think that research sounds so helpful. And we know that in the last 10 years, the role of neuroscience has played a bigger part in our understanding about how to equip young people better for the world, and how to ensure that learning happens better. And indeed, going back to Miranda's point, how we make perhaps more empathetically aware young people, so that we can have a more empathetic world. So Miranda, I'm going to come back to you now. And you started, when did you start Empathy Lab? What year was it that you started it?
Well, the big thinking that Sita referred to, where we gathered all these experts into a room and asked them if we were making enough of this research about reading, building empathy. And maybe I'll say about the brain bit about that in a second, because it's fascinating. And that was in 2015.
Please tell us about the brain bit, because I know it will be fascinating.
Well, it's so cool. And I think that anybody who's a reader knows this, that, you know, when you're reading a story, you're learning about other people. But there's this building body of research from neuroscientists and psychologists and others about what happens in our brain when we read. And basically, when you read a story, lots of different areas of your brain light up. And so, for instance, if you read about the word cinnamon, the olfactory cortex bit of your brain would react. So when you're reading about a book character and their feelings, that feels really real. And so some researchers describe it as a simulation of the social world, a bit like, you know, when you're learning to drive a plane on a kind of simulation machine. Reading fiction can play a role in being a sort of safe way of learning about other people who aren't us. And obviously for children, that's amazing. And the world of children's literature, I really do think we're in a kind of golden age at the moment of children's literature. And so our program is built on using the literature to teach empathy. And our initial guidance to teachers is, rather than when using a book and talking about it, focus not on the technical aspects or the plot, but on the character and the feelings, and stay within the safety of the book and the discussions within the book, because children will process that and sort out an awful lot for themselves by using the creativity of the story to understand other people better, and they play a crucial perspective taking role. So our work in schools took that as the starting point. And then we started thinking, oh gosh, well, okay, let's have an annual collection of empathy books, which we do every January. But it's the school's work has very much widened, so that we work with the senior leadership team on doing empathy audits and lots of training and lots of work on listening, which is such a crucial part of empathy. So the lab bit of our name is continues to be true. We're kind of really learning a lot all along the way, and working in this kind of wonderful creative, it makes me so excited, circle of psychologists like Helen, authors like Sita, and then educators like you, Rae. And, you know, together, I think we can play an extraordinary role in building children's understanding and empathy skills. And that's what Empathy Day, when we get onto that, is kind of very much all about as well.
So now I feel I owe a quick apology, because I described it as a triangle. But I much prefer what you said there, Miranda, that it is this circle, a virtual circle. And when we think about circles, it's so much about community. And that just makes me think about the word that Sita was using earlier about it being really holistic, thinking about the child holistically within the community. Miranda, you were talking, as I understood it there, the books give us an opportunity for the children to rehearse some things they may not have experienced, to think about them outside from their own experience. Sita, your books talk on themes of poverty, of inequality, of refugees. Some people might say, I'm not one of them specifically, but some people might say, there's enough challenge in the world. There's enough for the children to think about. Perhaps thinking about refugees, thinking about inequality, thinking about poverty, perhaps this would make children feel less safe rather than more safe. How did you come back on that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I have heard that, and obviously I don't agree with it. But I sense that the things that make us anxious are the things that are unspoken, and the things that children don't have the opportunity to explore. What Miranda was talking about was stories as a kind of empathy portal, in which, you know, you can travel to places, going through these portals that may not be your experience, but you are aware of in the wider world, and you can find a path through. So I'm always sort of playing with words. So I think of empathy, I look at the word path in it, and I see storytelling as a path through. and it can be a transformational pass through. So I was very interested, what Helen was talking about, the emotional response and the cognitive response. When you're writing stories, quite often at the beginning of the story, a child character will have an emotional response. For example, in Swallow's Kiss, which is the story for young readers that Empathy they have picked as one of their stories, is inspired by the work that I do at a refugee centre in London and have done for many years. And we run an art and writing class. And in that art and writing class, one day we were making birds, and the refugee adults and families in the centre were placing wishes on the wings for themselves, for their friends, and for their world. And myself and the wonderful illustrator Jane Rae went home, and on the bus that we travel on, we thought about a story where a young child would find these wishing birds and would reach into their wings, and they would be in languages that they didn't necessarily understand, and they would know that these wishes were precious. And the story is about that child called Blessing finding these wish bird makers and befriending one of the people that's made the wishes. So you can see from that sort of little illustration that a worry that any child might have about the world today, about seeing the treatment of refugee children, is placed within this narrative of empathy, where the children within the story are also acting. They are acting with empathy. And by taking any readers on that journey, you have kind of expanded their empathy portals. And you literally see when readers are reading the story that they are sort of gasping at certain moments and smiling at other moments. Sometimes you can actually see the action of empathy and how it's moving up through the body and releasing and coming out by not turning your back on the stories of the world that we are living in and the children are living in, but by finding a path, an empathetic path in which to tell a new narrative.
My goodness, that fills me with so much hope and positivity. Path, rivers, journey, but all about transformation, and something that children can do and we can do so that we don't feel hopeless. That's really inspiring. Thank you, Sita. Helen, you were saying earlier about older people losing empathy. And am I right in saying that you've got evidence to show that this happens? That people, does that happen to everybody?
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Oh, big questions. Thank you, Rae. Good question. What it is, some research has shown that, and this is neuroscientific evidence, that when children and adults view videos, for example, of discrimination, that mu suppression behavior that I mentioned in the brain is much more enhanced in children, typically. Now, this suggests mu suppression reflects the amount of empathy that we show in our brains. And it shows that children were much more aware of the discrimination and showed this than adults. So this type of research then goes on to suggest that actually, yes, it does get lost. It's as if, as we have this thing that, as we said before, there's not a lot of when we're born. Then we build it up through our socializing. And there are some nice questions about how can we build it and learn it. And my recent research has shown that we can learn it in classrooms, and we can learn it very effectively, even as a type of lesson, if you like. It sounds quite crude, but it's learnable. But it also shows, and I think as we grow older, we become what's called cognitively busy. So we're getting on with things, and we don't take the time often to stop and pause. Things that we build up are suddenly shut down, or can be. And not everybody, to answer your question, Rae, is it depends on a whole load of circumstances and situations, from your upbringing, your siblings, your situation, all sorts of things, but there is this capacity or danger, if you like, to lose it along the way. So to be reminded through literature, and the very powerful literature of that Sita has explained, and it's a way that doesn't make it scary, that doesn't make us turn away from bias and discrimination. And in fact, if it's done in a way where the narrative, as Sita mentioned, is one that is digestible, that is easy to read, that is informative and enjoyable, then we learn it almost second nature, and it's something that we can then integrate into our lives. And that holistic word you mentioned is very, very important. The social, the emotional, the two sides of empathy, but also the learning and the cognitive, because we are holistic beings. And so this type of exposure through the reading, through reminders, through my recent research I've done in the classroom with creativity, has shown that it can be learnt, and it can be learnt very well and effectively.
And we've had a question here. Is it harder to learn to be empathetic the older that you get?
That's a very interesting question.
It's a great question, isn't it?
It is a great question, and I would say no. And because, again, there are studies that have shown that with adults, when they are put into two scenarios where one is encouraging empathy and one doesn't, those adults who were in the, if you like, experimental condition where empathy was encouraged in certain ways, they were able to be, if you like, reminded and use it and continue with it. So it is something at all ages that can be absolutely relearned. It's touching base with what's going on with other people, but also I want to say then reflecting back on yourself and learning, being empathic for yourself. It's a two-way thing. It doesn't just stop with other people. You then feed that back to yourself and back again to the person. It's a continuing circle you mentioned. Is very, very important. And most importantly, what it does, the skill of empathy through the emotional side, which we may do more if we associate more with something, if we recognize something more, we'll portray a more affective type of empathy, a more emotional one. But also through the perspective taking cognitive side, what both of these things have the capacity to do is to drive pro-social action. And this is what, and this is why it is that superpower word that you mentioned right at the outset.
Yeah. And I was to come back to you, Miranda. The theme for this year on the 9th of June, and Empathy Day, is our human superpower. And have you got some good examples about how we can build more empathy, and examples of people putting empathy into action and driving forward good things in the world?
Yes, hugely. So in our schools work, having supported teachers and parents kind of understand more about empathy and work with literature to build it, we move on to social activism. And we've been working in a very deprived bit of Swansea with some amazing schools there on the theme of loneliness, and using incredible books like Tom Percival's Invisible. And then the children were encouraged, obviously things are difficult in lockdown, to work with and reach out to people who were in old people's homes. So they wrote letters to them and connected to them in really, really beautiful ways. And we have lots of other examples of children getting really fired up about putting empathy into action, whether that's in a kind of environmental sense. I think you did that in your old school, Rae, or taking very positive action like joining Amnesty's letter writing campaign to refugees or fundraising or whatever. So lots of examples. And Empathy Day ends with asking everybody to make an empathy resolution. And then we have a sort of empathy check-in month in November, asking how people have been getting on with their resolutions. And the children's resolutions are so wise. One came through last year, which was my empathy resolution is not to judge people before I've got to know them better. And this was, I think, from an 8-year-old. And I just thought, oh my goodness, if we took those small steps like that, the world would be a very different place. And Rae, at the right time, I can explain a bit more how Empathy Day is going to work this year, and things that, very practical things that people can do.
Great, because I looking at the questions that are coming in, people are asking exactly that. How can we get involved? What practical things can we do? So we must definitely cover that. And Miranda, what you've just said made me think about an experience from last week. I was observing a teacher, and she was reading a book to a group of children, and the book was called Brave. And in it, there was a scary wolf character, and the animals were finding ways to engage with quite a scary character. And a little boy who would only have been 4 or 5 because he was in the reception class said, "In order to be brave, you must have been frightened once." I thought that was absolutely incredible, because I have never thought about the meaning behind the word brave. And I learnt a lot just listening to that 4-year-old. To be brave, you must have had to have been frightened once. It was incredible. Sita, your books talk about this idea of activism. And have you got examples of either characters in your book that are activists? Because it's a word like activism, action, it's more than just being a receptor. It's about turning those thoughts, those feelings into doing something to make things better.
This is what I'm going to be talking about with the amazing, wonderful Anjali Ralph, who works, you might know her from her story, book A Boy at the Back of the Class, and her amazing work in Calais with refugee survivor people. We're in contact as writers and as activists and as friends, and whenever we see each other, we give each other a huge hug. Now, what's that got to do with the activist characters in the story? Because I think that there are some anchors in these stories which are to do with how we are at any age when we are trying to understand each other better, emotionally and cognitively. And the anchors are friendship, and the anchors are community. And quite often, like Lila Levinson in Tender Earth, she discovers her grandmother's banner bag. And these are banners that have been carried, the anti-apartheid movement. She has marched in Washington on these marches with his grandmother. And the child finds these banners and she takes them out of the bag. And with these banners are released a memory from history, but also they're released. This child understands that her friend Parry, who is a survivor from the war of Iraq, is facing the same prejudices and difficulties as her Nana was campaigning for. And so there's a kind of magical element to these stories that allows the child, and Lila is a very quiet child at the beginning of the story, who doesn't think that she's got courage or bravery, taking on Rae's point. And as she learns that the inequalities in her world, her confidence starts to grow. And she realizes there are ways in which she can stand up and help her friend. There are quiet ways, and she does end up, joining and sort of organizing a march, something you would never think the Lila Levinson at the beginning of the story does. But there are many, many different ways that the children in the stories activate hope and spread empathy. And sometimes it's by making a seed packet and collecting dandelion seeds and walking along a path and knowing that one day that path will grow more dandelions and that the bees will come and that will be a more beautiful path for other people. So there are very quiet children that spread empathy in the stories, and there are children who have sort of bravery as their coat and can go up and they can be on a march and rally other children. And I really think it's important when you're kind of speaking about empathy to say that there are very many ways of being empathetic. And an action that I'll be taking on Empathy Day is through Amnesty International by supporting a campaign that has been close to my heart. But it's also by going out into my community, and it's one of the things in the toolkit, going out into my community and just taking the time to walk slowly as a young child does, and seeing what acts I could do in my community to help the people around me, small acts sometimes.
So empathy there is for everybody, and the example that you gave of whether you are wearing a coat that's courageous and brave, or whether you are a quieter person, it can be transformative, not just for the people around you, but for yourself and your own identity and your place in the world. And therefore, I'm fully bought into the idea that empathy is a superhuman power. Helen, do you have some examples about empathy being put into action and driving forward good in our world?
Yeah, absolutely, Rae, thank you. And I love what you just said, and it's so true. It's a no-brainer, isn't it? And also what came through was what Sita just said, which is what I'm just about to say about my research, is that there are two factors I feel that are so important, as well as empathy, or part and parcel of empathy, and they are authenticity and unconditionality. And it's what you all have been talking about, Sita, with the authentic stories that are giving children the license to read, as it were. And then that unconditionality. I love what you said, Rae, about that boy who said about to be brave, you need to be frightened. You've given him the space, the unconditionality to talk about it, to understand, to empathize, reflect, and it's obviously spoken volumes to you. In terms of my recent research, we conducted something which, again, I think was very authentic and unconditional, in the sense that it was some research that took place in the design and technology classroom at secondary school. Year 7 and 9-year-olds, I'll start again, pupils in year 7 and year 9. And what it showed was that, what we did was give pupils an empathy instruction kit. This was made alongside the engineering department in Cambridge, and what we did was we gave this instruction kit to the children, or at least an experimental group of the children, and the main ethos behind this is to try and encourage the best, if you like, designers and engineers of the future. And this is where empathy is not just. It's a wonderful social and emotional skill, and it's good for connecting, and it's good for society at large, but it's also good for society in terms of the economy and what we do with our lives and the people who leave our schools. And what we wanted to get was these authentic and good designers and engineers, and encourage them for the future. And what it did show that was through putting this empathy instruction kit in place and exposing the children, some of them, to this, that it had a huge impact on the actual designs they ended up with. They designed, the aim of what they had to do was to solve asthma for young children, to be able to take their inhalers. And using this kit and understanding through empathy, they were able to come up with a solution that has actually now been taken by the NHS to be used. So it's groundbreakingly effective in that respect. So it can be taught in schools. And this is what we found through our recent research.
So empathy isn't a nice to have, it's something fluffy. With empathy, we get greater design, better design, more creativity, more innovation, better problem solving. So bringing empathy into the curriculum and making it not just a bolt on, but is something essential to a life skill, then is really important. And Miranda, in our last conversation that we had around empathy, we were very fortunate to have been joined by a teacher in Wales, where the idea of empathy is very much embedded within the curriculum. But I'm just mindful a little bit of time and thinking ahead to the 9th of June. Miranda, we've heard a lot about activism, hope, innovation, an essential life skill, a superpower. How can people get involved on the 9th of June? What are I think, have we got 9 activities, 9 superpower activities for the 9th of June? We're going to really stick this in people's minds, something they can do with those 9 activities. Can you give us an idea of that, how we can find out more about Empathy Day and how we can get involved?
Yes, and actually it's much sooner than the 9th of June, because we're launching at the end of next week our experiment for this year, which is called the Empathy Superpower Challenge. And the idea is that, based on that research, that empathy is learnable, and that, like a muscle, it grows the more we use it. We've created 9 activities in this challenge that absolutely anybody can do, can use with children in schools and libraries, but adults can do them as well. And there's a family pack that goes along with it. So these are in 3 groups: read, connect, and act. And in the read section, we're asking everybody to do a power pose with their recommended empathy book, so that we can get lots more book ideas and lots of reading going on, because empathy is reading is empathy building. And then in the connect section, there's some fascinating activities, including one called Human Discoveries. And you can download some question prompts and just fix a time to talk to somebody, use the question prompts and go a bit deeper. And then in the act section, there's the empathy walks that Sita was referring to. And there are loads of examples on our websites of go out to your local community with empathy in mind, notice, reflect, come back and think what you're going to do about that, and make an empathy resolution. And the airways are kind of flooded with all of that. So there are toolkits for early years providers, primary and secondary schools, and for public libraries. So people can just get those by signing up to our newsletter, which you just do from our website, which we'll show you at the end of this. And then there's a range of run-up events for if people want to learn more. Got a flagship amazing debate on the 25th of May, which we'd love everybody to come to, with psychologists and more authors. So there's some very practical, fun, creative things to do. And then finally, on the day itself, it's absolutely amazing. There's an online festival where we're harnessing the electricity and the influence that authors and illustrators bring, because they have a huge power to kind of electrify children. So they're going to be doing the challenge activities in an online festival, which can be streamed into homes and classes on the day or afterwards. And we're just gathering all of that at the moment, and it's really, really amazing. So you've got authors really stepping outside their kind of normal talk about their book activity, and doing empathy walks and listening exercises and just in-depth discussions with each other, and modeling for children what it's like to practice empathy, that it can be really fun. And it doesn't need to be a kind of, I'm going to completely change the whole of who I am. It can be small steps, and you can take them every day, and they can be incredibly nourishing. So I just feel so grateful to the book world, because all these incredible authors are joining in this empathy movement. And I really do believe there was a question about, how can we really change the world through empathy to make it more empathetic? And I really do believe that wiring empathy education into how we do things as a society. In Wales, there's a really interesting model where they've ripped up their old curriculum, and empathy appears in the new curriculum 35 times.
Wow.
And if they can do it, other countries can do it. So that's why we're working so much in Wales, and a lot of Welsh schools and families will be really joining in with the challenge.
And if you're not in Wales, everybody else can get involved, can't they? Because the information
Totally.
is all there. And it's all free.
internationally too.
And internationally, because we do have lots of international viewers. So particular welcome to everybody that's watching today or watching later on the recording following this. Sita, you're involved in the festival. Can you tell us about what you'll be doing as part of that wonderful festival that Miranda's described?
Favourite events.
Sorry, Sita, you were momentarily on mute. Could you start that?
Oh yes, I literally cannot wait, because it's not just the day, it's this whole period. There is this kind of build up to Empathy Day, and you know, all sorts of people that work with children and young adults get involved, and it's so exciting. I am going to be speaking Empathy to Power with Anjali Rauf. We are going to be sharing some of our favourite books that contain this incredible superpower. You know, the sort of books that, you know, make you're reading on a bus and they make you laugh out loud, or you know, cry, or think, I must do something. Those sort of books. We're going to be sharing those books, and quite a lot of them, with you. And we're also going to say who we might send these books to, so who they might help to grow their empathy portals or to explore something a bit different. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be speed dating with these books, going, you've got to read this book because it can spread empathy in this way, and this is who I'm going to send it to. And Anjali and I are both activists within the refugee sector as well as writers, and so we'll be recommending some books to do with empathy towards refugee children.
So you're really somebody who is not just writing the words, but you're turning those words into your own activism as part of that community, and that really is absolutely amazing. It's really impressive what you're doing. We've had a question in the chat today. A lot of our focus has been about books, and I loved what you said at the beginning, Miranda. Books are ubiquitous, but are we making enough of them to build empathy? And it sounds like Empathy Lab is really leading the way on turning all that empathy that we have in books into action. But the question is asking specifically away from books, not stories on a page or illustrations. Are there things that people can do to build empathy in their own community that isn't about books and libraries and reading? So I know I've put you on the spot now a little bit, so I'm happy for anybody to jump in the last 8 minutes that we have.
Good. I could just maybe talk about some of the empathy skills that all of us could practice that I think would make a huge difference. So we focus a lot on listening. One of the Empathy Day activities is download a set of listening switches and try and turn them on. So I really believe that change comes from each of us focusing on trying to be more empathetic. And so really focusing on empathy skills like listening, and you really can get better at it if you practice, I think is a very beautiful way forward.
I think that's a great example. It's not about books. It's not going to cost anything, but that idea of active listening could be quite transformative, couldn't it? Great example. Thank you, Miranda. Helen, do you have some ideas away from the books, away from the written word, away from the libraries that people could introduce to build empathy?
It's really just right what Miranda just said, which is spot on. It's that really active, authentic listening, which if we show, and what I want to say as well is that if we show it very early on, so the earlier from day one that we as, if you like, adults show it towards children, then what they see, they do. And it's emulating that behavior, if you like. So the more we do it, we learn from them, but also they learn from us. And it continues like that. So it's like any other type of behavior that you're exposed to. And so I would suggest even, so from day one, but even from preschool. So I've been talking about secondary schools and inculcating, if you like, or teaching it there, but it comes much earlier, or it should, and it should be part and parcel of curriculums, but daily life, and the way we show that type of behavior.
Thank you so much, Helen. I think there's something there for everyone. Sita, and finally to you on what can we do that's not about books, although we love them.
I'm going to share a little story about creativity and curiosity. So in one of my stories, I have a survivor tree. And in one of the little activities that has really kind of spread, like an empathy activity, I asked children to draw around their hands, and that hand becomes their leaf of change. And they write on each leaf what they might do every day to make an empathetic change, whether that be kind to a friend, to listen for a bit longer, to sit next to somebody that nobody sits next to at lunch, or whatever it might be, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then they place that empathy hand or leaf on a tree. And these beautiful empathy trees grow. They can be changed every week. So this is idea that you can grow. So, you know, Sita's empathy leaf might have 5 things on it this week. Next week, it'll have grown another leaf, which will have different things on them. So a very visual idea that you can do if you're in contact with young people, to show how you can build empathy and make this beautiful tree. And it's a communal tree because you can't do it on your own, so it belongs to everybody. The more beautiful the tree becomes, the more beautiful society becomes.
How beautiful. What a lovely example to finish us off with today, because all of us can apply that activity, whether it's in our own homes, whether it's just for us, whether it's in our schools, and that could really make a difference. And you talked about the tree growing, and we heard earlier on that we're just born with 10% genetic disposition for empathy, and our brains can grow. We can build it, and we can build empathy. So we eliminated the triangle. It's definitely a circle of community that we're building here. So full circle, growing, going right back to where we were at the beginning. We've had a special guest with us today, Helen, and I just, before we pass back to Amy, the special guest has sat there beautifully throughout. What's the name of our special guest this morning?
Special guest is Felix, the cat, and he's not showing a lot of empathy at the moment in terms of connecting. He's doing his own thing. But thank you for including him.
Well, just sitting there so docile and beautiful. I mean, I think pets are wonderful, and they certainly feel they're certainly such an important part of our lives, aren't they? Thank you very, very much, Miranda, for starting Empathy Lab, for sharing all of that knowledge and why you started it and what we can do. And we really can build brains, and we really can make empathy our superpower. Thank you very much for proving the point, Helen Demetriou, with the research that underpins all of that. And Sita, thank you very much to you for showing not only how you use empathy and characters, but how it's not just about what's written on the book, but you actively do that action in your own community with a community of authors. It's been a really inspiring morning this morning. Thank you so very much for joining me. I'm going to hand back to Amy now to wrap up. I'm sure you've enjoyed that discussion this morning, Amy.
I have, and I was going to say I am more convinced than ever, not that it wasn't, that empathy is a human superpower. And just listening, I think hopefully viewers will feel the same, that it's just encouraging to know that it is learnable, and that there are it's the small simple things that you can do to become more empathetic, to encourage other people to do it. And I love the idea of the empathy tree. So thank you, Rae, for hosting, and it was a great summary there to our 3 wonderful speakers. But and I really believe that the people watching this will have taken away some inspiration for their own days, for their own communities, for their own groups, to inspire a more empathetic world. So the Empathy Day, 9th of June, there's lots going on before that, as Miranda said, but to find out more about Empathy Day, you can head to their website. We have been live tweeting this talk as well, so you can go back to see the inspiring quotes that I've also scribbled down, as well as links out to the speakers and Empathy Lab's events. So thank you again, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.